The big debate between Trump and Harris is over, and we're going to take a closer look now at what they said about Israel and the Middle East. I'm Hanan Lishinsky, and in this All Israel News Update, we're going to look at the details of the prospective policies regarding Israel and the Middle East by President Trump and Vice President Harris. Now let's start by looking at what Vice President Harris said about Israel. It looks like she will continue the Biden-esque bear hug that we have seen here since October 7. Israelis were very positive in the beginning with how President Biden approached the whole crisis of the October 7. He visited Israel in the beginning and expressed strong sentiments of support, but then got more and more tough in his language toward Israel. It seems like Vice President Harris, if she becomes president, will continue this policy. Now we'll start with Harris. Contrary to what we will see later with Trump, Harris made several comments, part of which will be seen from an Israeli perspective as overwhelmingly positive, while the other part will be seen as negative. Let's start with the positive ones. First of all, she expressed her clear support for Israel's security and for Israel's right to defend itself and maintain this security. This is somewhat of a change from the tone that Harris herself took throughout the latest months since October 7, where she and President Biden had a kind of a good cop, bad cop going on, where President Biden would say very positive and supportive things for Israel, while Vice President Harris was more criticizing Israel and saying things that weren't really seen in a good light in Israel. For example, she also missed Netanyahu's speech at the joint session of Congress because she was at a sorority event, something that Trump brought up. So her clear expression of support is a change in tone, and it also goes back to the the traditional democratic stance of strong support for Israel's right to exist and its right to defend itself. In addition, seen against the background of the ongoing election campaign, it seems that these kind of sentiments, these kind of statements are meant as a signal to the Jewish part of the Democrat Party and to strong Israel supporters. Yes, some of them still are in the Democratic Party, and a signal to them to signal that the Democratic Party will not change its course completely, and also an effort not to lose many of the Jewish Democratic voters who have said they have doubts, at least, about the course of the Democratic Party and whether they would continue to vote Democrat against the background of several statements made by Democratic politicians, not the least Harris herself, as I mentioned, who were rather critical of Israel in the past months. Harris also reiterated her strong stance against Iran and its growing influence across the region. This also might not directly be tied to Israel, but as it's known, Israel has a large concern, of course, over Iran's nuclear program, and the nuclear agreement that was signed under President Obama, and then at least support for it continued under Biden, and Harris has also expressed support for this idea of diplomacy versus Iran, but her statement of a strong stance and a resolute stance against Iranian aggression across the region is again a signal counterbalancing very progressive and some pro-Iranian sentiments within her party. And as most Israelis, including the current government, were strong opponents of the JCPOA, the agreement mentioned before, signed by Obama and continued under Biden, this is a positive sign for most Israelis. On the more negative side of statements, and again, I just have to mention as a side note, I'm trying to give the majority Israeli opinion. There will be, of course, Israelis who have another opinion. But on the negative side, I think most Israelis would agree that Harris's statements calling for an immediate end to the Gaza war and an urgent ceasefire and stressing the urgent need for a ceasefire will be seen by most Israelis as something more negative. Just a week ago, for example, Israeli soldiers found 6 hostages murdered in Gaza. Now, of course, there is a large part of Israeli opinion a large part of the population that is of the opinion that a deal is needed now, a hostage deal and a truce. But I would still say that a majority of Israelis do not want a complete end to the Gaza war, before Hamas is defeated once and for all, and this danger, this threat that is hanging over Israel as long as this terror organization exists, will be ended forever. However, just as Harris's statements regarding the support for Israel's right to defend itself were meant for the more right-leaning wing of the Democrat Party, you could say, toward the more Jewish wing of the Democrat Party, the statement of calling for a ceasefire is of course trying to appease the more progressive wing of the Democrat Party, which has been stressing the Palestinian suffering and the civilian harm during the Gaza war. Now, just to be fair, as part of calling for a ceasefire, Harris, of course, also called for the immediate release of all hostages still in Hamas captivity, which, of course, is something that most Israelis support and see in a very positive light. However, it is worth mentioning that maybe the call to release kidnapped women, children, elderly people, Israeli hostages who didn't do anything to deserve their fate is maybe most Israelis see it as the minimum that can be expected of politicians, and not something that they will give extra points over. It's the bare minimum to call for the release of all Israeli hostages. Another point raised by Harris is, of course, the call for a two-state solution as the only viable long-term solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, this on the one hand, of course, is long-standing US policy, bipartisan consensus, and not something controversial in and of itself, at least in the US. It is also, again, aimed at the more progressive wing of the Democrat Party, which seeks a more balanced approach toward Israel and the Palestinians, and wanting to be more of the US to be taking more of a middle position rather than being on one side, which in their view, they're saying that the US is overly taking the Israeli side, of course. Now, the two-state solution within Israel is, of course, still a controversial topic. I would say a significant part of Israeli society continues to, at least in theory, advocate a two-state solution, especially because many Israelis want nothing to do with the Palestinians, so to say. They want to have a separation from the Palestinians and not be responsible for them. On the other hand, of course, especially in the wake of October 7, most Israelis see that, especially at this moment, in this period, there is no hope for a two-state solution. And the constant talk by the US, by US officials, Biden administration officials, about a two-state solution that would be implemented either as part of a hostage deal, hostage and truce deal, either with Hamas, or a larger deal that would include Hezbollah, or even the normalization with Saudi Arabia, it's just seen as completely unrealistic and something that is not worth mentioning at this point. But of course, the fact that Harris mentioned this is, of course, again aimed at unifying the wings of her Democrat Party, the more progressive, and the wing that is more supportive of Israel. Now let's look at the other side of the aisle, where former President Donald Trump continued saying what he has been saying for months. And it has to be said that for Israelis, some of them are very strong supporters of Trump, at least regarding his Israel policy. Many Israelis are somewhat unsettled by Trump's statements. So on the one hand, there is very strong support, and we also saw the very strong actions taken by Trump during his presidency supporting Israel. But on the other hand, there is a very strong instrumentalization of the issue of support for Israel, and this is something that is unsettling for Israelis, especially looking at Trump's unpredictability and his flighty persona in the eyes of some, which can be seen, for example, with his relations with Bibi Netanyahu, which started out very strong, and then when he felt like Netanyahu had stabbed him in the back, cratered, and now they appear to be back at a very strong level. So this is something that many Israelis are considered and cautious about. So regarding what I call the instrumentalization of support for Israel, this, for example, is what I mean when Trump accuses Biden and Harris, as he has done numerous times over recent weeks and months, of hating Israel and not supporting Israel enough. Now, this may or may not be true, But of course, it overlooks the bipartisan consensus that has existed in the US of support for Israel across party lines. Trump is making this a partisan position. He's using it to attack the Democrat Party. And whether or not you support this, of course, also in the eyes of Israelis, is dependent on whether or not you think that the Democrats really hate Israel or they don't hate Israel. Now, the same can, of course, be said about the somewhat drastic claim Trump made that Israel would cease to exist within 2 years if Harris would be elected president. Now, on the one side, this, of course, is hyperbole. We all know that Trump doesn't really think that Israel would cease to exist. And of course, this kind of language and rhetoric energizes his pro-Israel base and also feels very good to supporters of Israel and even Israelis who feel that there is very strong support by Trump, that he feels very strongly about this issue. But on the other side, for once, it completely ignores the Israeli military capabilities, which were shown not to be impregnable and perfect, of course, on October 7. But I think it is understandable that some Israelis would say, you know, what is it all? Are we all completely dependent on the US and our survival is completely in danger once there is a president who maybe doesn't love us? And of course, we also have to mention that, again, this uses support for Israel as a cudgel to attack the Democrat Party. And even if this is true, it doesn't bode well for Israel and for the larger issue of support for Israel in the US in the future. And a final point in this category is the often repeated claim by Trump that the whole attack, the whole October 7 invasion and massacre wouldn't even have happened if he was still in office. Now, again, this may sound to some Israeli ears like Israeli security is completely 100% dependent on the US, which isn't true. On the other hand, of course, it justifiably points to Trump's successes in the foreign policy realm during his tenure, where we saw that Iran, for example, was much more deterred from taking offensive action across the region than it is now. And of course, we know about the connections between Iran and Hamas. So it of course is a hypothetical, but to many Israeli ears, this is a justifiable point that Trump brings up. And it is something that many Israelis wish the US policy would return to the policy that Trump had under in his time in office. Trump later went on to explicitly boast about his stance, his aggressive stance against Iran, which again, as I said earlier, is something that I think most Israelis support, especially the current government and supporters of the current government of Netanyahu specifically. They have, most Israelis have always advocated an aggressive stance against Iran, especially because Israelis are possibly the first target of an Iranian nuclear strike, as the Iranians themselves have claimed. And so this Iran nuclear deal that was signed by Obama is something that a large portion of Israelis have rejected, and they will be happy if Trump comes back to office and will be more aggressive against Iran. By the way, this is also something that most of the US allies across the region are waiting for. So Saudi Arabia and several of the Gulf countries, Egypt even, have been very unhappy with the Biden administration's some would call it appeasement of Iran and their somewhat weak stance against Iran's growing influence across the region. And most Gulf, most Middle Eastern allies of the US, including Israel, want a more tougher stance against Iran. Now, to underline his previous points, Trump also pointed out that he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem and also recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israeli territory. Two of the strongest moves he has made in support of Israel, and something that I would say all Israelis are very thankful to him for. So when we're looking at all of this from an Israeli perspective, I think it's very important to note for our viewers in the US, also in Europe and in other places, that when Israelis look at US policy, of course, Israelis will be divided by a kind of right and left divide, and 50% of the population will maybe tend more towards the Republicans and the other half more to the Democrats. However, it's important to note that what is being called the culture war in the US is something that isn't as important for Israelis. Israeli society is very different. Israeli society is very, one could call it right-leaning regarding security, but the Israeli mainstream, at least, is very US Americans would call it liberal on social issues, abortion and gay relations and all of that. Most Israelis really don't care about all of these issues being discussed in the US. They care about US foreign policy and how it affects Israel and the broader region. So that is what they're looking at. And in light of this, most Israelis tend to wish for Trump to come back to office simply because Trump's foreign policy, not just in regards to, for example, for direct support to Israel, for example, the embassy move and the Golan Heights recognition, or the weapons shipments. It's not just that, but it's the broader foreign policy that the US follows across the region. So especially the Iran, countering Iranian influence. And this is something that I think most Israelis would tend to trust a Republican administration more than what we have seen with the Democrat administration, the Biden administration, over the last years. Now, another point that I'll just quickly mention, but that is probably worth its own update, is a growing anti-Semitism across the American society, at least as it's seen from Israel. We, of course, have the progressive anti-Semitism, for example, in universities, that has been growing also inside the Democrat Party. But on the other side, there has been growing anti-Semitism that is part of a certain non-interventionist streams within the the Republican Party, and more right-leaning streams of thought. So a potential presidential election and its influences on the growing anti-Semitism in the US is also something that Israelis are keeping a close eye on. Israel's largest fear in all of this is not that US support will completely disappear, even in the coming years. That isn't likely at all, to say the least. But it could become a bipartisan issue, and that would be worse enough. If Israeli policy regarding the US would have to change every 4 years or every 8 years, it would critically endanger not just weapon supplies and arms supplies, as I mentioned earlier, and regional policy, as I also mentioned, regarding Iran or other threats that could develop across the region. But it would also endanger US support that is critical in the international forums, in the UN and in other international forums like the International Criminal Court and institutions of that kind. And if this kind of US support would ever end, even for a couple of years, it would be a direct threat to Israel's security, and that is something that Israel will hope that it can avert in the future. To keep up to date on the latest developments regarding US-Israeli relations and all other news regarding Israel and the broader Middle East, visit us on allisrael.com or on our social media channels.